some days I just want to say your guess is as good as mine, but see what we can do with it. You know, as much as I'd like to be able to say I understand the stories of Jesus that he told us, this week as I read this parable, I have to admit I was absolutely stumped. I have learned that parables, at least for Jesus, were not intended to be allegories. That means they're not supposed to be interpreted as stories about God and Jesus and humankind and whatever categories you want to put in there. But as a Jew, who never, by the way, stopped being Jewish, Jesus told stories that were designed to make us think about the human condition. Stories that were designed to help us discuss and figure out ways that people of faith were to treat one another and to care for creation with behaviors that would help us resemble the kingdom of God here on earth. Now, I tried for a couple of days to understand this particular parable as something other than a metaphor, but my highly trained Christian mind, so accustomed to seeing this story as an allegory, could not see the king in the story as anyone other than God. And that was a problem because God wasn't very nice. It made the understanding of the story close to impossible. So, as I have done in the past, when I am absolutely stumped by something in the New Testament, I sent an email to Dr. Amy Jo Levine, a New Testament scholar at the Vanderbilt School of Theology, a United Methodist seminary in Nashville. Now, it turns out that Dr. Levine is also Jewish, and therefore is able to see and hear Jesus in ways that I just cannot. And as always, Dr. Levine, AJ, if I may be so bold, wrote back that afternoon with a list of ideas for how to look at the parable. And I'll read you just a portion of the list. She said, it's a tough parable. There are ways, a variety of ways you can move into it and out and then escape only slightly wounded. Okay, that scared me. She said, so what do you want to call it? Parable of the rude guests, parable of the overstated response to insult, parable of the ignored slaves, parable of the unstable king, parable of a disaster at a wedding, and why you might want to elope. Why if it can't be a wedding feast, no wedding, no bride? Why do we want to see the king as God? Remember, parables are both like and unlike the real world. What else does Matthew have to say about king? On and on and on for this much longer. So, I spent some time pondering over the list she gave me, and I want to give credit to Dr. Levine. The idea for this sermon comes directly from her. In fact, she asked me to share her greeting with everyone this morning. Here we go. During my 20s and 30s, I was involved in community theater as an actor. It won't surprise anyone to learn that I love being on stage. I love singing and playing characters in front of other people. And yes, I was born to be a show-off. I know it, and I own it. But I also took my turn as a behind-the-scenes worker as well. I was a prop person, a stage manager, and a vocal director. And I learned how much goes on behind the scenes to make what happens in front of the curtain successful. But I have to admit, being behind the scenes didn't get much applause or much recognition or any sort of credit. Yet behind the scenes, people got a lot of blame when things went wrong, but not much else when things went right. I learned working behind the scenes is often a thankless task. Which brings us to the slaves in Matthew's story today. A king gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those invited from their homes to the banquet. Those invited did not come. So the king sent his slaves a second time with a really enticing description of the food being served. Frankly, I would have been there in a heartbeat. But some guests left town, while the others seized the slaves, tortured them, and then killed the slaves. Well, it was after that incident that the king sent his troops, his army, his soldiers, to kill those who refused to attend, not only kill them, but also burn their cities. And then he sent more slaves. He had a lot of people working for him. He sent more slaves to bring people off the streets to attend the banquet. Now, one might begin to think that the food was getting cold by now, but that didn't seem to be a concern. So one person attending did not have the right clothing, the king ordered those attending the banquet to tie the guy up and throw him out on the street. Now, I think the end that you're talking about, the guy getting tossed out, Don, if we put it in terms of people, that was a person with a very fragile ego. The king had problems. He had anger management issues. Not unlike some people we know. If you don't play it their way precisely, tossed out. I think that's part of what that parable is saying to us. And would anybody with a righteous, a faithful mind view, a sense of purpose in life, treat anybody else that way? I don't think so. Well, it's obvious, as I said, that this king had anger management issues. And it's equally obvious he was not at all well liked by his peers. But more than that, it seems that this king depended entirely upon his slaves. He depended upon people whose names he probably did not know, whose lives he absolutely did not value, and people who received absolutely no recognition for making his life possible. And these were the people who suffered because this king was so completely despised by his peers. The slaves were the ones who delivered the invitations. They were the ones who prepared the food from the field to the table. They were the ones who ran to inform those invited that the food was ready. And then they died because those invited just did not like that guy, the king. They went into the streets then in order to fill the hall, to soothe the king's fragile ego. The slaves did all the work and received absolutely no reward for their efforts. Now, in today's world, I think we would call those slaves essential workers. Essential workers are those people whose names we usually do not know, but whose work we depend upon to feed us, provide for us, keep us healthy, care for us when we are sick, provide us with power, clean water, and clean communities. Essential workers include farmers, truck drivers, delivery people, factory workers, and warehouse operators. They're the ones who make sure our mail gets delivered from the post office box to our homes. They're the ones who make our clothes, and they're the ones who make sure that our medications arrive on time and that our food is safe. Gotta tell you, this church runs as well as it does because of all the people who work behind the scenes as volunteers. Those whose names don't get mentioned often enough, and those who are usually embarrassed when their names do get mentioned. This church runs as well as it does because of all the paid staff, I'm not including myself at all, you pay me well, who give the church much more than we can afford to give them in salary and benefits. The building expansion, the building planning, and all of the oversight was completed because of volunteers who offered their time and their work behind the scenes without expecting recognition and without expecting reward. The landscaping is being done by people behind the scenes whose names most of us may not even recognize. We depend a lot in this congregation on people behind the scenes. We are fed, we are clothed, we are kept warm or cool, and provided things we need to stay alive by people who we depend upon, but whose names we probably do not know. We are surrounded by people whose work we could not do and whose pay does not reflect their value to us. We depend on people who willingly put their lives at risk to save ours. And unfortunately, in many ways, we treat essential workers today like the king in the story treated his slaves. We take them for granted. I often think of the poor IT people, internet technology in today's world. Oh my gosh, our entire world is being done on Zoom right now. If you don't know what Zoom is, it's a thing you download on your computer, you click on, and you get to join a meeting. Oh boy, you get to join a meeting. Or you get to take a class, or you get to teach a class, or you get to talk to your friends and relatives. And I think of those poor internet technology people working at Zoom, or working for Chromebook, or working for anything online, whose names we do not know, but who we call and yell at whenever something doesn't work. We're dependent on those people right now. We take them for granted, we overlook them, we don't notice who is whom, and as a result, we usually don't notice when they are injured or killed or abused by the caller. As long as the next person steps up to do the job, we seldom notice a change, except when it goes better or worse. You see, Jesus told the story in Matthew to a crowd that included those who worked behind the scenes. At the same time, he talked to those who were considered the rulers and the elite in Jerusalem. Jesus talked to people who humbly performed their jobs, as well as people whose egos were as fragile as the king in the story. Jesus told the story to the same kind of people who are listening today. Now, I will be the first one to admit I don't know all the names of the essential workers whose work guarantees I can live the life to which I'm accustomed today. I admit I don't know the names of the workers somewhere in the world who made what I'm wearing today. I just enjoy that I got it at a good price. I admit I don't know who among those people work hard but are not rewarded with salaries and benefits that allow them to provide for their families. I admit there are times when I take my frustrations out on essential workers who did not make the decisions who frustrate me and who do not have power to make the changes that I think ought to be made. I admit there are people whose lives I depend on, but whose names I've not bothered to learn. I admit there are essential workers that I take for granted and often forget to thank, and perhaps I'm not alone. Perhaps we all have those moments where we depend on people whose names we do not know, whose work we do not recognize, who we do not even notice. So this story asks us to reflect on this question. Who works behind the scenes, whose names we do not know, and whose work and lives we take for granted? I have to tell you, I don't know who makes the bread that I buy in the store, but I depend on that. I don't know the names of the people who sort out the recycling that I put in the little red bin, but I depend on them. I don't know a lot of the names of the people who make my life possible, but perhaps this is the parable that will help us rethink how we treat those behind-the-scenes essential workers. Perhaps this parable might keep us from being the angry, demanding, despised, ego-inflated king. Perhaps this parable will make a small difference in the lives of people whose work is essential for us to live the way we do. More than anything, I think this parable was told and written to make us think, to urge us to ask ourselves if we are treating the behind-the-scenes essential workers the way we want to be treated, or if we are treating people like they don't matter. Perhaps this parable is designed to make us think about those times we accept an invitation and then blow it off at the last minute. Perhaps this parable is designed to make us think about those times somebody has come into a setting that we have arranged and they're not doing it right, and we wish we could throw them out. Perhaps this parable is designed to make us think about those times that we have felt like we are the ones in charge, and that everybody ought to be doing the things that we think they ought to be doing when they ought to be doing them. And when they don't, we get angry, or our ego gets bruised. Or maybe we realize we don't have as much control and regard as we thought we ought to have. I think the point is, if this parable does not make us uncomfortable, then we've missed the point of the story. Amen.